It's that time of year when teachers are starting to think about professional development and continuing education courses for the summer. I am so excited to announce that the Savvy Dance Teacher Applied Dance Science Teacher Training course is back again for another year. It's happening September 1st and 2nd in the Vancouver area, and registration is now open. For those of you who may not know, the Savvy Dance Teacher is a 2-day in-person practical course that covers the latest in applied dance science topics. If you're looking to incorporate more injury prevention, functional anatomy, active mobility, strength and conditioning, and lots of other stuff into your teaching, this is the course for you. For more information, check out www.allegroperformance.com/thesavvydanceteacher. And if you use the code SAVVYEB before July 1st, you can save $100 off your registration. And now, here's today's episode.
Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Today, we're going to talk about functional movements or functional movement patterns, and specifically one functional movement that I see all the time in dancers that dancers actually really struggle with or even can't do. But before we actually dive into what that functional movement is, I just want to sort of clarify what I'm talking about when I'm talking about functional movement. And you'll hear this phrase a lot sometimes in the fitness space or strength and conditioning or even like kind of child development. Like it gets thrown around in a lot of different areas. But essentially functional movements are movements or movement patterns that are considered to be the sort of basis of more complex movement patterns. And the way I like to think about it is these are some of the first foundational movements that we learn how to do as infants and toddlers before we can learn to do more complex movements. So before we can learn to, jump or climb stairs or run or things that are more complex in nature, we learn some of these more foundational or functional movement patterns. A lot of the times, these are also considered sort of essential movement patterns. We talk about them a lot in the context of older adults and aging populations. And if people lose the ability to do these functional movement patterns, whether that is through mobility limitations or more often than not, it's through strength limitations, like they decline in their strength enough that they can no longer do these functional movement patterns, that is often when we see older adults lose independence and lose their ability to complete tasks of daily living and things like that. So, what is the functional movement pattern I want to talk about today? It is the squat. And I know you're probably thinking, like, wait a second, dancers squat all day long. Like, that's something that dancers are doing over and over again. What do you mean that they can't do it? And what I want to break down today is the difference between a squat and a plie or knee bend or whatever we want to call it in dance terminology, because they are different movement patterns. And what we often see is that dancers struggle with the more foundational or functional movement pattern of a squat. And I see this day in and day out. Anytime somebody comes in for an assessment at the clinic, basically anytime somebody comes in, it's one of the little screening tools that we do. So if you have ever been to any physio probably, but certainly if you've ever been a client at my clinic, you know that I'm going to ask you to go through some sort of foundational movements or functional movements to screen and see where things are at. And often that's going to include like a spinal roll down, usually a marching kind of movement on the spot where I'm looking at a side joint mobility and other things as well. And I'm going to ask you to do a squat. And 9 times out of 10, I'll get the dancers, feet parallel, hip width apart, whatever, and say, okay, and, show me your squat or do a squat or whatever the instruction is. 9 times out of 10, they do a plie. And then I'm having to sort of correct and say, okay, we're going to do that again, but this time we're going to do an actual squat and not a plie. And sometimes that's enough of a cue, and a dancer can change their movement pattern, and we will see a more squat movement pattern. But more often than not, there's a lot of cueing that goes into that. And even then, sometimes people struggle. And this is something that probably at least once a day in the clinic, I'm having this discussion or this cueing. And oftentimes parents are in the room and they usually end up like laughing a little bit and being like, oh, haha, they, can't do a squat because they can only do a plie. And it, is somewhat comical in the sense that if we think about how highly skilled dancers are and some of the absolutely incredible and complex movements they can do, when you think about it, it is a little bit comical that they can't do a basic squat movement, but underlying that is actually concern on my part because it is such an essential, foundational, functional movement pattern. And again, when we think about these functional movement patterns, like a squat, if we think about it just from our day-to-day life, so not even in any sort of like an athletic, setting or anything, but every time we get on and off a chair, or every time we have to get on and off the toilet, or things like that, we should be using a squat sort of movement pattern. And if we are not able to do that, we're using a different movement pattern instead, and we may perhaps see some movement dysfunction or muscle imbalances or things like that develop. And again, just to like tie this back to a squat being a foundational like kind of movement pattern, if you've ever spent any amount of time observing little kids, like especially toddlers, playing or really doing anything, they spend a ton of time in a deep squat position. Like it is not uncommon to watch a toddler be playing with a toy or, playing for ages in that deep squat position. And they can, get their butt pretty much all the way to the floor. Heels are still down. They're in a large amount of hip flexion, knee flexion, and kind of playing in that position. And we see them develop that ability to play in that squat position before we see them develop the ability to, again, do higher level things, jumping, climbing stairs, things like that. They develop the coordination and neuromuscular control to control that squat pattern. But what we then see is when we start to train dancers in more highly skilled, highly refined movement patterns, we often lose the ability to get into these more functional movement patterns. So I'm going to keep using this example of a plie because it is such a foundational movement in a lot of different dance styles. And a lot of kids, if you're starting dance, especially people that are starting young, often ballet is one of the first styles of dance, or, maybe it's creative movement or something, but it usually encompasses elements of teaching plies and things like that. And so if you think about how we then cue a plie, we spend a lot of time with these dancers cueing that very refined movement pattern where our trunk is going to stay upright. Teachers use all sorts of verbal cues, imagery, even practicing being up against a wall and sliding down the wall so our trunk is staying upright, those types of movements to teach this refined plie skill, but oftentimes at the expense of kids, and especially younger kids, losing some of their ability to do that sort of foundational functional movement pattern of the squat. And so that's not to say we're going to change the plie, because we're not, and it's like I said, a very, foundational step in a lot of different dance styles. And there is that aesthetic of keeping the trunk upright and the alignment of how we perform a plie in dance. I am not at all saying that we should be trying to change that, but it is important for dancers to know and understand the difference between a plie and between a functional squat movement pattern and still be able to perform the functional movement so that we don't lose that functional movement at the expense of training these more highly refined, highly skilled movement patterns. So in terms of a squat, what is a squat? I mean, there are many different variations of a squat. And I'm not going to get into the different variations today. So if we start to look at strength training and kind of go down that rabbit hole, we could spend all day talking about the different nuances of different variations of squats, how we're loading squats, where our foot position is, where our trunk, like all of that. That is not the point of today's podcast episode. Who knows? Maybe in the future we'll do something about that. But today I just want to talk about a very foundational, let's call it like a body weight squat movement. That is just that functional movement pattern. It is a very complex movement pattern. It seems like it should be simple, and especially because it is a functional movement pattern. And like I said, the basis of lots of other more complex athletic patterns that we like develop on top of that. But it is on its own still quite complex because it is a whole body movement of sorts. So if we think about what is actually happening in a squat, and we'll kind of start from the top down, I guess. And I'm going to ignore the upper body for right now because, like I said, we're thinking more like functional body weight squats. I'm not going to worry too much about like what our arms and things are doing. But if we think about our trunk in a squat movement pattern, there's going to be a forward inclination or a forward movement of our trunk as we go into this squat movement pattern. As our trunk moves forward, and ideally with a neutral spine position, so we're going to keep that spine in a neutral spine, maintaining our neutral curvatures, but we have this forward inclination that happens of the trunk, that is in turn going to cause flexion to happen at the hip. So we have like a flexion moment that happens, and that is often achieved by the hip sort of like translating backwards or posteriorly to counterbalance the anterior translation or anterior inclination of the trunk. So trunk moves forward, and therefore to counterbalance, hips have to move backwards because otherwise we will fall on our face. So we have these counterbalances that are happening, which is part of what makes a squat a little bit complex. Once the hip has gone into flexion, we're also going to have flexion that happens at the knee joint as well. So again, flexion moment at the hip joint, flexion moment at the knee joint. We are then going to get anterior translation, or again, anterior kind of inclination of the tibia, so of the shin bone. That's going to travel forwards in space, and that in turn is going to create dorsiflexion or flexion at our ankle joint. If we then continue thinking down into the foot, there is going to actually be some pronation that happens at the foot as well, but I'm not going to get too caught up on that for right now. So we have this like complex series of movements and then counter movements to counterbalance everything that's happening. So trunk moves forwards, hips then have to flex, they move backwards a little bit. We then get knee flexion. We're going to then have that anterior translation to counterbalance some of that posterior movement at the hip, and then we have dorsiflexion that's happening at the ankle joint. So you can see that there's a lot of things at play that are happening in a squat. It is one of the reasons why it's a really great training tool in terms of when we think about like strength training programs or when we're looking at like conditioning programs. Squats are oftentimes programmed really commonly, and again, lots of different variations of squats, because they're great at building full body strength. There's a lot of things going on. So if we think about, okay, then what is controlling or what is having to like work with those movements, squats are great because they utilize a lot of large muscle groups. So we're using our glutes, we're using our quadriceps, we're using our hamstrings, we're using our core quite a lot in a squat as well. And so again, when dancers are kind of short on time, but looking at wanting to build strength and wanting to build capacity in their body, squats give you good bang for your buck because you're hitting on lots of different areas all at once. If we then contrast a squat movement pattern to a sort of more traditional quote unquote plie, and I'm going to get you to imagine that you're still doing this in parallel, because obviously if we then think about a plie in first position or fifth position, we're adding an element of rotation. So we've kind of changed things even more so. So I don't want to overly complicate things right now when we're thinking about those biomechanics. So imagine somebody feet in parallel, hip distance apart, kind of same place your feet would be for a squat. But now we're going to think about how a dancer would sort of quote unquote naturally do this movement. And this is, again, what I see in the clinic. So I will ask a dancer, okay, do a squat there for me. And what we will typically see is their trunk stays upright. So same as how they've been taught to do a plie in first position or fifth position, we do not get that kind of anterior translation of the trunk that happens. So the trunk is going to stay upright. And therefore, there's going to be less flexion that happens at the hip. So as the trunk stays upright, there isn't that same need to counterbalance that. And so we don't get as much flexion that happens at the hip. That in turn, though, is going to create increased flexion moments at the knee joint. Because the hip is not flexing as much, and again, we don't have this same offset of counterbalance movement, we are going to see a larger knee flexion moment happening. So we also are potentially going to see increased demands for ankle dorsiflexion, although oftentimes what I see is dancers are limited in ankle dorsiflexion, and so they just stop the movement short of what would be considered sort of like full depth, and so the movement is coming, in some cases, like almost entirely from the knee, and there's relatively little involvement at the ankle joint, and then minimal involvement at the hip, and the trunk is staying upright. When we think about muscle like recruitment or what's kind of happening from a more muscular perspective, because we're not getting those same counterbalancing movements, we're going to have increased demand on muscles around the knee, specifically the knee extensor muscles, but we are not going to have the same muscular recruitment of muscles around the hip. So specifically kind of like the glute muscles or hip extensor muscles in through there. We also are going to see less recruitment of trunk stabilizing muscles, we'll call them, or like trunk muscles that are being used to stabilize the spine. Because again, your spine is staying upright, so there's relatively little demand on what those muscles are doing. If we are comparing that more upright sort of quote unquote plie or knee bend or whatever we want to call it versus a functional squat pattern. So hopefully that is clear and you can kind of visualize in your head what the difference between those sort of two movement patterns is. But why do we care? Why do we care if a dancer can't do a squat if they can do a plie well? Because some people will come in and sort of say, well, this is how we do it in dance. And, they will sit down or stand up off of chairs using a more plie, quote unquote, style pattern as opposed to a, functional squat pattern. And some people will sort of say, well, this is, what is more functional for dance? And they may be right that maybe a plie is more functional for certain styles of dance. There are styles of dance that use a more squat pattern of movement. So I'm not necessarily going to agree with that argument that it's more functional. But again, if we think about that dancer being a human first and a dancer second, we want to be able to optimize these foundational functional movement patterns. And there's a few different reasons for that. So first of all, injury prevention is a big one. And so when we are sort of primarily using a plie movement pattern and we're not utilizing squat movement patterns, we see a lot of hip dysfunction that happens in these movement patterns. And probably partly due to the fact that people who are doing a lot of plies or like that's their primary movement pattern are often probably also working in turnout a lot of the time. And so we end up developing these imbalances around the hip where we actually lose some of the ability for the femoral head to glide posteriorly in the hip socket. And we develop restrictions and tightness in the posterior aspect of the hip, specifically the deep hip rotators, but even the glute muscles. And so we lose some of that mobility. And this often is one of the things that can contribute to a lot of gripping in the front of the hip or like hip impingement or snapping hip syndrome and all sorts of issues that can develop at the hip. So especially for the dancers that come in who are reporting any sort of hip symptoms, whether it be any of those above things like impingement, snapping hip, labral issues, or anything, the first thing that we're going to look at is their squat movement pattern and trying to optimize that squat movement pattern, because I can pretty much guarantee you that it is not going to be something that they are super familiar with if those are some of the hip issues that they are experiencing. So we do see a lot of hip issues develop when dancers lose those mechanics or lose that functional movement pattern. We can see more knee issues develop as well because of that loading that is happening into knee flexion in that more upright plie. So again, when the hip is not contributing as much, more of that loading is going to go to the knee joints in through there. And so we can see knee issues that are a result of that. Again, we're not saying dancers are never going to plie. They are absolutely going to. But when we look at cross-training or strength training or training outside of their dance classes, if we can train more of that squat movement pattern, then we can kind of offload the knees, or at least what's the best way to say this? Not redistribute, but sort of strengthen in other ways to make sure that the knees can then withstand those forces that we are demanding from them when we are doing repetitive plie movement patterns in dance. We can, what's the best way of putting this? If we have dancers who cannot squat efficiently, they are less able to absorb impact around the hips, the knees, the ankles when landing from higher impact things. So again, I am not saying that every jump we do in dance is going to look like a squat jump or anything like that. But if we are training these movement patterns and they are learning how to move in these foundational movement ways, that is going to translate to their dance. And so it is something, again, that we want to make sure that they have that efficient movement pattern where hips, knees, ankles are all able to work together to help with shock absorption and impact mitigation. And then I kind of alluded to this already, but just sort of we see muscle imbalances develop, most specifically around the hip, but they can be in other areas as well when dancers are favoring a plie movement pattern over being able to also perform a functional squat pattern as well. In terms of other reasons why we care, so, from my perspective, obviously as a physical therapist, injury prevention is a big one for me, and more often than not, I'm actually dealing with the injuries that are coming in the clinic as a result of this sort of further on down the road. But if we can address this early enough in dancers that they then do not develop knee issues, hip issues, those types of issues, that's even better. But there's other reasons as well that have nothing to do with injury prevention why dancers might want to consider optimizing their squat movement pattern. And one of them is to improve our kind of explosive power for jumps. So jumps, and especially kind of the big explosive jumps, rely really heavily on glute strength and quad strength. And if we want to be able to optimize that explosive power, squats and training them correctly and loading them and training them from a strength perspective is going to translate into being able to generate more of that explosive power. So sometimes in dancers, that's actually more what we're focusing on when we're working on the squat movement pattern. If, they maybe don't have a history of injuries or injury prevention isn't super motivating for them, but they have goals of improving their jumps or their explosive height or their explosive power, squats are one of those ways that we are going to be able to help to improve that. If we're thinking about core strength and stability, yes, we can absolutely do isolated core exercises, and sometimes those have a time and a place, and sometimes those might be what we're starting dancers with in a core strengthening program. But if we think about dance and the demands of dance, we are very, very rarely isolating our core and being sort of static. And if we think about a lot of traditional core strengthening exercises that are maybe planks or even crunches or something like that, those don't look anything like dance movement patterns. If we think about the demands of dance, we need to have core stability and core strength while we are moving dynamically around, ideally, a stable core. And so if we think about something like a squat, that is more closely going to resemble the demands of dance. So our core is going to be strong, stable, whatever we want to call it. And then we are moving body parts around that. So again, a squat is fairly static in nature. And so sometimes we need to, branch out or expand even beyond that. But if we're thinking about core strengthening, it actually is a really effective way of building up core strength without actually just working the core in isolation. We're working it in conjunction with all of those other areas that are moving at the same time. And then the sort of final reason I'll put on this list of like, why do we care is, and I guess this kind of falls, and I talked about it a bit with like injury prevention, but just general overall hip health. A lot of dancers who come into the clinic, their goals are maybe to increase their turnout or increase their extensions, or like a lot of times people like the terminology that they use in the clinic is that they want to work on opening their hips more. They want to work on hip mobility. They feel like their hips are restricting their dancing and things like that. And again, we tend to work so much in turned out positions, and that really overworks those hip external rotation muscles. And we almost never work into internal rotation. I'm not saying we're going to do squats in internal rotation necessarily, but if we're doing squats with our feet in a more parallel or kind of quote unquote neutral position, as we work on getting that posterior translation at the hip joint, that actually forces lengthening or elongation at those deep hip rotator muscles. So it can actually help with our hip mobility and in turn even help with our ability to recruit those muscles and use our turnout if those muscles aren't overly tight and gripping in those movement patterns. So again, it seems maybe counterintuitive. I think people think, oh, I'm going to go to physio to work on my hip mobility, and they think that I'm going to give them 5 million different stretches to do for their hip, when in reality, a lot of what we're working on is actually building up some of those more functional movement patterns, because chances are they're probably already stretching anyway. Most dancers who come in are already doing a number of different stretches for quote unquote hip opening. And if we really want to improve whatever their goals are around, whether it's hip mobility or extension height or whatever it is, more often than not, we want to look at how the actual mechanics of the joint are working. So maybe I'm going to be giving them stretching exercises, but if I am, chances are it's going to be into internal rotation and not external rotation. But more often than not, looking at like squat mechanics is a big part of improving that hip health in through there. All right. Final thing I just want to kind of finish up with, and this is especially for teachers who might be listening, because I think, but even dancers, if you're like, I wonder if I know how to do a squat. If you are looking at your dancers, what are some of the kind of like common issues that we see, or what am I seeing that's kind of going wrong when we're looking at dancers trying to learn how to do a functional squat? So number one, and we talked about this just in terms of the difference between a plie or a squat, is that they don't allow that anterior translation of their trunk. So they really try and keep the trunk kind of upright in through there. And sometimes what we'll see is if you then kind of cue that, where I'm like, okay, you don't have to keep your body upright, allow your trunk to move forward with you as you're squatting, they'll allow their trunk to move forward, but they won't then counterbalance that movement with the hips translating backwards. So they end up almost doing like sort of more of like we'll sometimes call it like a good morning or a waiter's bow, or more of that type of a movement pattern. So really struggling with not quite knowing what to do with their trunk in terms of how far forward or how to counterbalance that trunk movement. So that's the number one thing that I'm going to be looking for, is what is their trunk doing? Number two, still sort of related to the trunk, is what is their pelvis doing? Can they keep their pelvis in a neutral position? Because more often than not, what we'll see is if they're allowing that anterior, inclination to happen at the trunk, often the pelvis is actually relatively posteriorly rotating. So it's tucking underneath as their trunk is moving forward. And so what we want to see is the trunk, so the spine, and the pelvis moving as one unit, essentially, so that that anterior translation is happening at the trunk, and then the pelvis is also going to relatively anteriorly translate over the femur. So it's just staying in line, but more often than not, what we'll see is like kind of like a tuck that's happening with the pelvis in through there. So that's one thing, or the second thing I guess I'm going to look out for. So if we're looking at and evaluating a dancer's squat pattern or squat mechanics, we want to look at their trunk, we want to look at what their pelvis is doing, and then we're going to look at what their hips are doing. So can they counterbalance that trunk movement with their hips? Are we seeing hip flexion happen? Are we seeing the hips sort of get that posterior glide or posterior rotation happening as they are going into that squat movement pattern? Next thing, I've lost track of how many we're on. So next thing we're going to look at is that anterior translation of the tibia. Are they allowing their knees to translate forward so they can counterbalance the effect of the hips moving backwards? And this is something I see a lot, is that dancers will, you'll say, okay, allow your hips to move backwards, or sometimes I'll give cues like, imagine you're trying to sit down on a chair that somebody's pulled just an inch too far away from you or something like that. And they will get the hip movement part of it, but they don't then get the counterbalance of the anterior translation through the tibia. And so they end up falling backwards. Their weight, they don't sort of counterbalance that center of gravity or center of mass, so they end up falling backwards. And so allowing that anterior translation of the tibia to actually happen so that they can get that knee flexion moment and counterbalance that. Interestingly, and this is a bit of an aside, but I'm just going to throw it in right now anyway. So sometimes people actually struggle with that anterior translation of the tibia, and maybe it's because of limited dorsiflexion at the ankle joint, or there's an anatomical reason for it. But oftentimes when we start to talk about it and break it down and look at this squat movement pattern, dancers will sort of say that the reason they're doing that and the reason they're falling backwards is because they've been told not to allow their knees to travel further forward than their feet. So this idea that as you go into a squat or as you go into those types of movement patterns, that your knees should not travel in front of your feet. And this is something that was sort of common in the fitness space for a while. I have no idea where this idea came from or this cue. I think it was maybe an idea that sort of surfaced in regards to trying to decrease some of the compressive loading at the knee joint in a squat movement pattern. I have no idea. I actually have not looked into what the kind of history of this cueing or this movement pattern is. But our knees have to be able to travel forwards over our feet. So it is okay for our knees to come further forward than our feet when we're going into this. And for dancers, it's funny because, again, they'll sort of have heard this or been taught this over the years that in a squat, their knees shouldn't translate forward like that. But if you think about a plie, that is exactly what happens in a plie. Because we're not flexing at our hip and our trunk is staying upright, the movement is by definition coming from the knees. And so our knees are automatically traveling over the feet. So I don't think that this is a cue that came from the dance world. This very much from what I've seen, and even in my non-dancer population of clients when I used to work more with the general population, this idea was fairly pervasive. And I do think it came more from the fitness space. If anybody knows where this kind of came from, or who knows? Let me know, because I'd be curious, or I should just look into sort of the history of it. But I just want to say, it is absolutely 100% fine and necessary for your knees to travel forwards over your feet. And again, if we think about functional movement patterns that we're doing, like going downstairs or things like that, they absolutely need to be able to do that. What we also want to make sure of, though, so again, back to what are we looking at in a squat movement pattern, is we do want the knees tracking over the feet, in the sense that if we look at the center of the kneecap and then sort of where the feet are lined up, we want that to be tracking sort of kind of over the second toe or between second and third toe, so that we're not seeing the knees dropping inwards into a more valgus position, or opening outwards into what we'd call a more varus position, where the knees are going outside of the line of the foot. So this kind of idea of knees over toes is correct if we're using that terminology to mean we want our knees to line up with our toes when we think about like a straight line in that sagittal plane. But in terms of anterior translation of allowing that knee to travel further forward than our foot, that is absolutely fine. The other thing I will add to that right now is that, and I maybe should have said this earlier in the episode, but people's squats are going to look different depending on the proportion of their body. So if we have somebody who has a really, really long trunk and relatively shorter legs, their squat is going to look really different than somebody who has a relatively shorter trunk and longer legs. We will also have squat patterns that are going to look different if somebody has quite a long femur, so thigh bone, compared to their lower leg bone, or vice versa, if they have longer lower leg bones compared to their thigh bone. So everyone's proportions are slightly different. So this idea that everyone's squat needs to look exactly the same is not correct. But in terms of your own body and your own proportions, we should be seeing these relative shifts of anterior and posterior movements being counterbalanced against each other. So the degree that someone's knee is going to anteriorly translate in front of their foot is going to depend a little bit on, say, the length of their femur in relation to the length of their tibia and things like that. So maybe not everyone's is going to travel in front depending on their proportions, but I have had dancers in the past, one dancer in particular that I remember, who had always been told not to let her knees come in front of her feet, but had an incredibly long femur. And so she literally could not squat. Like, she would fall backwards every single time because she was having so much hip flexion that was happening because of the length of her femur, which was totally correct. But then she'd been told not to allow that anterior translation at the tibia. And so she couldn't counterbalance that weight and so she just in her head had always been told or always thought like, oh, I can't squat. Like, for whatever reason, she had a limitation. I can't squat. It's not something I can do. Like, I fall over. I can't squat. And as soon as we gave her permission to allow the knees to travel forwards to counterbalance that hip movement, she had absolutely no problem squatting. She had a great squat. So again, we just have to be careful with how we're phrasing things and where this terminology is coming from, because it is going to impact how somebody is able to perform a movement. And no two dancers or no two human squats are going to look exactly the same because it is heavily influenced by your sort of anatomy and the relative length of different areas. So that's what I'm going to say about that. And then back to what I was talking about in terms of the issues that we're seeing at typically with dancers when they are struggling with a functional movement squat. The last thing that we want to make sure we're taking a look at is how much dorsiflexion they are able to achieve. So how much their ankle is able to bend in through there. And like I said, this is actually a really, really, really common restriction that I see that limits a dancer's squat pattern. And one way that we'll sometimes check this is if we just elevate their heels a little bit. So stick them on a rolled up mat, or just like weight plates work really well, just so their heels like an inch or so raised, and get them to perform a squat in that pattern. If that changes their ability to perform a squat and specifically what their trunk and hips and knees and things are doing, then there's a good chance that it is the ankle, like the restriction of dorsiflexion, that's really impacting their squat in through there. So just something we want to pay attention to and look at, because it's something that I think gets missed a little bit when we're looking at squats or, sort of evaluating a functional squat pattern, is the impact that restricted dorsiflexion has. Because again, it's not going to allow that anterior translation at the tibia, which then in turn is not going to be able to counterbalance what's happening at the hips. And so what most people will do is they will end up sometimes, people go about things different ways, but what we'll often see is people don't get that same amount of posterior translation at the hip because otherwise they'll fall backwards. So they end up just hinging forwards from their trunk, but then not using the hip and the knees as effectively as they could. So it becomes, again, just a little bit less of a functional pattern. So those are just a few of the things that we would be like looking at and evaluating in a squat pattern. And then depending on what we're seeing, we're going to look at, okay, what do we need to address? And again, in some dancers, it's simply a matter of teaching them and cueing them in a proper squat and the differences between that and a plie. And they actually have no physical limitations in terms of their ability to perform it. It's just a movement pattern they're not familiar with, or maybe like neuromuscular control wise, they're not used to it. But that's, best case scenario, that's really easy to then just kind of like teach them and cue them in that. In other instances, if there is any sort of kind of dysfunctions or restrictions that have developed either at the ankle or at the hip or the knee or wherever it is, we then are going to have to go in and ideally address those issues so that they can access a functional squat pattern. All right. I think that's all I've got to say about this today. Apparently, I had a lot more to say about it than I thought I did. I thought this was going to be a short episode, but alas, it is not. So like I said, squats are super, super, super foundational functional movement patterns. They are certainly not our only functional foundational movement pattern. And I may in future episodes dive into some of the other ones that we look at as well. But I will say that squats is the number one pattern that I see that dancers really struggle with, and kind of being able to or knowing the difference between a more dance style plie versus a functional squat. So we want to make sure that our dancers can move in functional ways that are going to serve them as being a human being, because that is also going to enhance their ability to move in more complicated, intricate patterns as a dancer as well. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap it up today. If you have any questions or want any clarification on that, please feel free to reach out. My email is in the show notes, or you can reach me on social media at Dance Physio Erika, Erika with a K. If you like this level of kind of nerding out on things and looking at movement patterns and breaking things down, this is one of the things that we cover a lot in the Savvy Dance Teacher course, which is my 2-day in-person applied dance science course. There's a whole section on like functional movement screening and looking at some of our key functional movement patterns and assessing those and trying to learn, what might possibly be affecting or restricting some of those movement patterns. So if you are at all interested in more of this type of content or information, check out that course. It is happening September 1st and 2nd this year in the Vancouver area. All of the information is on the website, www.allegroperformance.com/the Savvy Dance Teacher, and there's a little dash in between each word, so it's the-savvy-dance teacher. It's also in the show notes. All right, that is where I'm truly going to wrap it up today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.